Ukraine's war has been a world war for nearly a year. But now it has spread to Africa. Last week, I predicted 2 events in the war in Ukraine. I said Russia would conduct a high-profile attack to grab the headlines. And this happened. The Danube River grain shipping infrastructure was hit. And this comes at a time when the world is watching Ukrainian grain. This grabbed the headlines. And everyone noticed it, and it affected grain prices. I also said that Russia would follow classic Soviet military doctrine that when a unit on the front lines is under pressure or even being overrun, they do not move up and reinforce the unit. Instead, they advance elsewhere on the front. And that's exactly what has happened. The Russians are not directly pushing back against the Ukrainian ground counteroffensive. They are containing it, but they're pushing back elsewhere. This past week saw an African leader summit in Moscow, and this is the pushback. Because this summit occurred against the backdrop of the coup in Niger. Africa has been a proxy battleground all through the Cold War. And the Vladimir Putin just maneuvered the Biden White House into an untenable position. And they also weakened support in Africa, both for Ukraine and for any international criminal court action against Russian leadership. The history of the West in Africa, of Europeans and Americans, is controversial. It, to a degree, has always been, but it is especially today. And the Soviet Union played off of this. That the West was the oppressors and they were the liberators. They used it for propaganda purposes. Obviously, there's some truth to it. Their goal was just make themselves look good. As African countries and the West push for the reinstatement of the elected president in Niger, with the implied threat of military action, Russia is positioning itself as an alternative to Western influence, including some promises of free food aid. Now, this is a second front in another way also. You see, the Wagner Group is heavily involved in Africa, and not in a good way. And right now, I suggest that Mr. Prigozhin might find the African climate to the liking of his health, especially if he can do a favor there for his friend, Mr. Putin. So this is a major geopolitical move for Russia. Now, likewise, in a similar vein, last week I mentioned the fact that the grain shipments through Eastern Europe are putting strains on countries that have really supported Ukraine. And this also came to the forefront this week with the European Union directly addressing this. They're attempting to move the grain shipments through the country as quickly as possible. They're sending millions of dollars to the farmers affected in those countries to try to help them out. And the United States is offering to pay to build grain silos in Ukraine. Combined together, Russia is making moves that cost them no troops, no soldiers, no ammunition, yet put major pressure on Ukraine and its allies. However, there is another equally tragic front that Vladimir Putin has opened. And this is the increased use of Russian glide bombs. In a way, this is old technology, as far back as the Second World War. But the joint direct attack munition that the United States deployed in the 1990s and has used ever since is actually one of the most cutting-edge weapons. It takes a dumb bomb and turns it into a smart bomb by bolting a navigation package on the back to steer the bomb. It's changed the face of warfare. It's been used for about 30 years. And the Russians have their own copy, their version. The Chinese do too. But the Russians' version is built into the bomb. Well, over the past few weeks and months, we have seen increased use of a bolt-on package against Ukraine. And this is significant for several reasons, and tragic also. For starters, Russia has lots of bombs. In 1945, the Cold War began, and it extended into the 90s. So, for 5 decades, the Russians were building lots of dumb bombs. Well, so they really have a limitless supply of bombs here. And what this technology allows Russian pilots to do is launch their payload outside the umbrella of Ukraine's air defense network. And then it glides in to hit the target. The bombs they have reportedly been using are 2-ton bombs. And they have been launching scores of them each night. Now, this bomb is not as good as the joint direct attack munition, but it doesn't have to be, because the Russians are not big on extremely precision targeting, as we've seen. This opens another issue that's going on right now also, and that is that this is not what the Russians have traditionally used. The Russians built their system into their bomb. The United States needed a guidance system that could be used across many aircraft platforms. That's where the joint part comes into the joint direct attack munition. The joint comes from, it's used by the Marines, the Navy, the Air Force, and all their different airplanes. So the Russians chose not to be as concerned about the platforms it's launched from. Well, now they need to apply it to lots of bombs. I am not suggesting the Russians and the Chinese have not built their own versions of the Joint Direct Attack munition. They have. What I am suggesting is the possibility that to some degree this version was reverse engineered. We have this weapon system has been in use for 3 decades. It's been used by a lot of nations around the globe. And even if every American munition with a Joint Direct Attack munition package actually exploded, not every country will have maintained their weapons as well as the United States. Some of those did not go off. Some of these packages survived. This is significant because it would not be the first time a Western weapon system was reverse engineered. There was one of the early Chinese air-to-air missiles came from the reverse engineering of an American missile. There was a skirmish between Taiwanese and Chinese fighter jets. The Taiwanese fired a missile at the Chinese. It struck the Chinese jet, but did not go off. Whether the pilot of the Chinese jet knew he actually had the missile in his airplane or not, he returned to base. The Chinese supposedly removed the missile and, according to the anecdote, reverse engineered it. The reason I mention all of that is a Office of the Director of Naval Intelligence report discussing Chinese exports to Russia of not just semiconductors, not just semiconductors based on U.S. designs that we license to their companies, but also semiconductors built in the United States. Apparently, there's a lot, they have shipped a lot of them to Russia. It is not a far-fetched conjecture to suggest that there is a factory in China doing what they do very well, mass producing an electronic device, in this case a bolt-on satellite navigation system, and shipping them en masse to the Russian Air Force. Now, all of this sounds very bad for Ukraine, and it's certainly not good. And it reinforces 2 factors. This is a world war that we are involved in. We cannot help Ukraine win this war by just sending them weapons. Whether they're mothballed weapons, they may be the best weapons ever. But we can't take our warehouses of mothballed weapons. We can't take weapons, even weapons in active inventory, and just ship them to Ukraine and expect them to win. They cannot merely outfight Russia. We have to outthink Russia. And unless our strategies change, this war is winnable. I want to make that clear. This war is winnable for Ukraine, for the West.
The dawn's early light, what so proudly we hailed at the twilight last gleaming, who stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight. Oh, the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave? On the shore dimly seen through the mist of the deep, where the foes of the host in dread silence reposes. What is that which the breeze o'er the towering steep, as it fitfully blows, half concealed, half discloses?